Hi everyone, my name is Sami and it is an absolute privilege to be speaking to you today. I hope you guys are all well. I am passionate about seeing God's truth transforming lives. As a church community, we have heard from God and He's spoken to us and said, build altars in your lives. And that is going to require us as a people to be courageous. So today I want to talk about being courageous. Why do we need to be courageous? Because when God speaks, when we respond in obedience and move in faith, that is definitely going to aggravate the enemy. He is going to oppose that because what he doesn't want us to do is to hear and be obedient to God. So we are in the storyline of Ezra, and we have got to chapter 4, and what we're going to do today is we're going to read a bit of Ezra 4 and see what parallels there are for us in this story and what encouragement we can take from it. So let's read it together. Now, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So I want to look first at when God speaks, we need to hear what he is saying. We then have a choice. We have a choice to move in obedience and faith to what he has spoken. So for God's people in this part of Ezra, God's spoken about this time. They know that he has promised this time would come, that Jerusalem would collapse and they would be exiled, but then they would return and start to rebuild the temple. So this had been talked about, and they would have known that God has spoken this promise. We see it in the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah and other books in the Old Testament. This has been promised, this time where they would come back from exile and start to rebuild the temple. So when King Cyrus gives the go-ahead, they go, they move, they act in obedience, and they move in faith, and they go to start to rebuild the temple. So we can see this beautifully spoken through the Bible, that when God speaks, his word is truth and his promises are fulfilled. And we can see this time and time again. And this is the same for us today. God has spoken to us. Have you heard? Have you listened to his voice to your life? On hearing the voice of God, we then have a choice. We can respond and move in faith and obedience, or we cannot. So there's always a choice not to respond. Perhaps we think that our views or our opinions are different to what God is saying, and so therefore we don't respond in obedience and hear what he is saying. And this can really cause us to miss out on the blessing of God. We see this in the Bible when people or peoples choose not to respond to God's voice, that actually they miss out. This is why the people of God were in exile. They chose to be disobedient and they missed out on the promises of God. So what we have is a choice. We have a choice to hear God, to respond and move in faith and respond in obedience. And with anything that God says, we need to know that what he's speaking to us and what we feel he's speaking to us is echoed through the Bible, that we see it elsewhere. We're not just making it up or forming an opinion. And we can see through the Bible that God's heart is for us to worship him and to love him and put him first in our lives, to build altars, to live our lives as living sacrifices. And it says it in the Ten Commandments, and in one of the Ten Commandments it says, "You shall have no other gods before me," and that can be found in Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20. God has called us to love him with all our hearts, all our souls, and all our minds, and that is in Deuteronomy 6, echoed in Luke 10, Matthew 22. It's calling us to love him above all else, love him with everything of our lives. And then in Romans 12, 1-2, it calls us to give our lives as living sacrifices to God. God is calling us, and he has been, to give our lives, to bring worship as a sacrifice, to give our lives as sacrifices to him. So it's been amazing to chat to different people in the church community, people who are choosing to spend time as a family and doing times of worship and devotion. People are getting up earlier than they have been before, that they're setting aside time before the day, that actually they're giving up stuff that's really not helpful for them, that they are putting apps off their phone that actually just wasted their time, or they are managing their screen time. Things that are really practical and helpful when we want to allocate time and give time to God. These little steps actually really cause great opportunities for us to then build altars in our lives. So we have looked at how we need to hear God, and as a response of hearing and listening to him, we move in faith and obedience. And this requires courage. So the opportunity for us to be courageous and to be people of courage is to say no to the enemy and yes to God's truth, saying no to fear and yes to God. So I want to talk about this and talk about the opposition that we face. And this is my second point. So the choice we have in courage in facing opposition. So let's look at the story in Ezra 4. So in chapter 4, the Jews are facing opposition. The enemies approach Zerubbabel and say, "Can we help build the temple?" And this might not seem like it's a big deal, that they're being actually quite helpful and not being that mean. But these guys that have come, the enemies are pagan worshippers. So they worship lots of other gods. And the idea that the king and these guys have got is that the more gods they worship, the more blessing they will receive. So they're coming to Zerubbabel and the other guys and saying, "Can we help? Because we want to receive more blessing from another god." And Zerubbabel is so sharp and so, "No, you're not going to come and help us," because the people of God have had this history of being disobedient and worshipping idols, and that is how they had ended up in exile. And Zerubbabel is very short, and he says, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." So after that, the enemies then write letters about the Jews and the rebuilding, and that frustrates their plans, and the plans are put on hold for a good few years. So in this time, the people of God would be like, really frustrated, probably feeling fearful because people are scheming against them, and that can't have been a good thing and a nice feeling at all. But we can see that the Jews actually, the people of God, they keep hold of what God has said. They don't give up. They keep on holding on to this promise that the temple would be rebuilt. And after this period of time, it is, and they do see it rebuilt. So all through the Bible, as God's people are obedient to his voice, they face opposition. We can see it again and again and again. And even with Jesus, when he comes and he is being baptized, Father from heaven speaks down on him, "This is my son in whom I'm well pleased." and loved. And then suddenly Jesus has to go off into the wilderness, and he's tempted and deceived by the devil, which Jesus resists. But even Jesus faced opposition all through his life. We can see opposition after opposition. So if we're followers of Jesus, we can definitely expect this opposition. So we know that there is a spiritual battle going on. When we have knowledge of that, we are equipped with our best weapon. And our best weapon is choice. So we always have a choice. The enemy wants you to think that you have no choices whatsoever when it comes to fear, but you do. You can choose to say no to fear and yes to God's truth, and that will change your life. The enemy does not want you, does not want me, does not want us as a church community to step into the promises of God, to listen to what God is calling us into, and for us to be obedient and move in faith into those promises. He doesn't want it. So fear can rob us of that calling on our lives, and we don't want to be people who miss out on the calling of our lives due to fear. As a church community, our value is of courage and being courageous. So we want to say yes to God's truth and no to fear. Like Zerubbabel, we have to be so aware, even if it's subtle opposition, that we need to say no and focus on what God has said to us. So what does that mean for us? So we know that God has spoken about building altars, and we know that there's going to be opposition to that. So what would that look like? It might mean that your day suddenly gets really busy when you said that you're going to spend some time with God. It might mean that when you come and worship as a family, that actually it's really difficult. We had a couple of weeks when we decided we're going to worship as a family, where we would have several week after week of someone going off in a strop or a tantrum, or the right song wasn't played. And don't worry, it wasn't Luke. But yeah, we had several weeks of that, and Luke and I were just a bit like, oh, do we even bother? But we thought, no, God has called us to build altars as a family, and we kept persevering and teaching the kids about worship and what it means, and we've seen a real shift in that, so that's been brilliant. Another thing can be outside factors that come and oppose us. So we know God's calling us into something, and then suddenly something comes from outside. I had a real experience of this week, where government restrictions and things were announced, and schools that were doing home learning. So our kids are now being homeschooled on Monday, and I'm also working at home. And I had this initial panic of, just felt really quite heavy and overwhelmed and a bit despondent, to be honest. So I spoke to some good friends who encouraged me to pray, and they prayed for me. And I had to say sorry to God, because I was thinking that I needed to do it in my own strength, and that's not what he said, and that he will work things all out for his good and glory. And I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. So after I'd apologised for a bit of self-pity and I'd listened to what he says, I felt so much lighter, and I feel like I could do things again, instead of just feeling totally demotivated and almost like I couldn't do anything myself. So these are all different ways, but we've got to be so aware that they're opposition. Ultimately, they want to stop us loving God with all our hearts and building altars. So let's just be really aware of them. So as I finish today, I want to finish with an encouragement that actually God's heart is so for us. His desire for us to choose him is so high, and he wants us to choose him again and again and again. And that's why he's given us free will. But he did know that we wouldn't always choose him. So there's wonderful grace for us in our lives, that when we don't do well at making good choices, we don't want to fall into feeling sorry for ourselves or condemnation or guilt. We want to look at Jesus, who is the perfect one, who never made a bad choice. And it just shows God's wonderful grace on our lives. So be encouraged. Don't condemn yourself if you've made some bad choices. Look to Jesus. He has given us so much, and he wants us to choose him again and again and again. Every act of obedience in our lives to the voice of God will cause us to grow and step further into what he's called us into. So let's go for it.